that while food loss and waste might sometimes be talked about as though it's one problem, which you might reasonably deduce, therefore needs one solution, the reality is really that the nuances of why a particular food type is wasted at any one stage of the value chain varies greatly. And this problem is truly a systems level problem that requires system level set of solutions. So in spite of this fact, though, the good news is that whether we're discussing the best investment strategies in Kenya or Mexico or in the US, there are a handful of investment action areas that are truly cross-border. So as you'll hear from our expert presenter shortly, as an investor, if you really try to focus in on driving policy action, reducing food loss on farm and in production, changing how the private sector operates, changing how consumer behavior and culture is, and supporting those who can champion and coordinate the work, then there are many co-benefits that can be manifested to satisfy pretty much any investment thesis. So with that, I'd love to invite my colleague Alejandro Enamorado to the webinar, who's going to speak more about the important role of capital in this fight against food loss and waste. Alejandro?
Thank you, Alexandria. And so I'm Alejandro Enamorado, the Senior Manager of Capital Initiatives at ReFed. Next slide. So framing our discussion today is the concept of impact investing. So next slide. If I were to ask everyone who's attending today what you do, what is your approach, I'm probably going to get many different answers. And so I want to acknowledge that impact investing, there are many different flavors and approaches. Knowing who's in the audience today, we can make a safe assumption that your approach to impact is intentional and evidence-based, but what there will be variation in is this idea of expected return, where we will be talking about both philanthropic opportunities as well as going up to market rate. Next slide. And so when it comes to the opportunities and the funders that are going to be speaking today, they're going to be living within this bound. Acknowledging what Alex has said is that food waste is truly a systems and a very complex problem. So what we've grown to know is that traditional approaches to finance aren't going to work for this sector yet. And so ReFed has estimated that the need to really reduce food waste in the US is going to be $18 billion annually. And the main message that you can take from here is that waste generators are expected to make up a majority of the capital that should come to reduce, that should scale food waste solutions. But what I want to mention that is very relevant for the audience today is that funders, where they can play is in this idea of catalytic capital, because we feel that this funding can unlock everything else that's out there. And so why is catalytic capital important in the context of food waste reduction? Alex was alluding to this, but when we take on this challenge, we're effectively going to need to rethink and reimagine how the food system operates. And that is an outcome that the market can't really deliver on its own right now. And so ReFed has mapped out the ecosystem of solutions that are out there today. And this is across our various key action areas. To really simplify it, I'll just like to say that think of these action areas as areas within the supply chain. So starting on farm, going all the way to the consumer. But if you were to take anything away from this overwhelming slide is that there are many solutions that exist out there today. That doesn't mean that they can't get better, but there are many solutions out there today, and a lot of them tend to work with one another. And then the other point that I also want to mention is that there really is no silver bullet that exists today that completely solves the problem. I really hope, and this is a dream scenario, that we can find that as funders, but right now, as it stands, it's various solutions that work together. And so using more universal language, so taking our framework and putting it into words that hopefully you funders are a little more familiar with, I like to think of food waste solutions within prevention, rescue, recycling, but you could think of it as business to consumer, for instance, supply chain interventions, waste valorization, which will be converting waste into a value-added product or compost or the like. And then there's rescue, which is redistributing food to those that are in need. And so that you're prepared for what you're getting into, and this is just meant to outline the type of models you can expect within the food waste ecosystem. These aren't meant to be hard, fast rules, but I think you can cover these broad strokes, and this is what you expect. To simplify within prevention, so this is preventing food from going to waste, the models you'll typically see are going to be for-profit businesses as well as best practices. So these can be software, this can be education, behavior change. And I think I want to highlight both the education aspect and the consumer, both education campaigns and consumer behavior change as very important levers within trying to solve food waste. But I also want to acknowledge that they are very difficult areas to invest in as a sole funder and require a little more coordination. Looking at rescue, what one can expect is those will typically be nonprofits. So food banks, gleaners, charities that are redistributing food. Lastly, in recycling, one can expect that these will be very asset-based businesses. So think infrastructure, both large and small, collecting and then processing that waste. These will typically be for-profit businesses or government services. And before I move on from the slide, though, with all this variation, I hope this is getting everyone's minds churning. You can see that there's different structures that you could employ if you're going to fund any of these solutions, whether it's low interest loans. You could even see typical venture when it comes to more of the tech-enabled solutions in prevention. And another word that I've been hearing a lot of is going to be this idea of blended finance, particularly for asset-based businesses, whether you're thinking of a digester or a composter. But I just really hope that this slide can at least get you starting to think about ways that you can deploy capital in this sector. Moving on to the next slide, I think it's really helpful to ground where we are at today. And so globally, 600 billion has gone towards climate finance, and that consists of government, private, and philanthropic capital. And this was covered in the previous slides, but an outsized amount of emissions, about 1/3 of global emissions, comes from the food system itself. But less than 4% of that climate funding has actually gone towards food systems. And so you can see that there is this big opportunity, this mismatch of capital that is not going into food systems. Next slide. And so focusing on food waste, and this is from a US context, we have tried to track where funding has come in to really support food waste solutions. I mentioned that this $18 billion is required in order to significantly reduce food waste. But what we've seen in the past is that a lot of the funding that we've seen come in is from venture capital and private equity, and that has amounted to around $1 billion per year. In addition to that, we've seen philanthropic capital come in, and that has made up, depending on what you look at, 40 to 300 million. The variation there is that will include some of the food banking funding. And then the last bit that is missing here is government funding, which we've seen a lot more interest from the government over the past couple of years. And so that will make up a good portion of it. But if I were to take away one thing from this image you're seeing today, is that there remains a significant gap of funding for food waste solutions. Now, seeing where funding has gone when it came to food waste, you'll be hearing from a number of speakers today, but a large amount of funding has gone into edible coatings and shelf life extension. It has gone to imperfect produce, and it has also gone to software for retail businesses. And that's grocery retail. These are businesses all that have been able to communicate their return on investment. So that's where investors have really gravitated towards. In addition to that, funding has gone towards food waste disposal infrastructure. So think of insect farming, anaerobic digestion. And then when I flip over to the philanthropic side, a lot of that funding has gone towards supporting nonprofits rescuing food or building the ecosystem. What Alex was saying, like a lot of these ecosystem enablers, they've been getting a lot of funding too when it comes to philanthropic. And so before I go on to this slide, actually, what I want to say is that even though all these funding categories got funding, that isn't to say you should avoid these categories. Because again, because of this huge funding gap, these are just the areas that have been getting funding, but it doesn't mean they've been getting a sufficient amount. And so moving on to this slide, here are a few examples where impact funders can get involved in the value chain. You've already heard a lot of themes that Alex has talked about, different leverage points that you can go into, whether it's consumer education, whether it's on farm. This is just meant to provide examples throughout the supply chain that you can achieve a really big impact. And so I'll give an example right here in reshaping consumer environments, If you find a solution that really works with portion sizes, that is going to get a significant amount of impact because that is a large driver of waste in the US. And if you look towards the beginning of the section, so that's in Optimize the Harvest, where there's a lot of waste that happens on farm due to specs or due to market conditions. If you find ways that you can really valorize that or create a new market, that's another area where a funder can really get a huge impact.
Now with kind of a shared understanding of the science of food waste and climate, thanks to our friends at Project Drawdown, as well as the critical role capital providers can play of all types, thanks to Alejandro, let's really bring to life exactly how funders and investors like yourselves can put smart, impactful dollars to work in solutions that are really moving the needle around the globe. So some of you might already be familiar with what you're seeing on the screen here, which is a global food loss and waste investment report. This was a large collaborative effort that was developed for release at COP28 in Dubai. The goal of the report was really to give funders an understanding of the challenges and opportunities within global food loss and waste reduction efforts, providing opportunities for where they can put their capital resources to work to have the greatest impact. ReFed was really grateful for the opportunity to work alongside so many knowledgeable specialists and strategists and subject matter experts, more than 75, in fact, from all over the world, thanks to funding from the Bezos Earth Fund and IKEA Foundation, Robertson Foundation, and the Betsy and Jesse Fink Family Foundation, which in the end, this report really brought to life more than $300 million in ready-to-fund investments to transform failing food systems and deliver major climate, economic, and social impact. So any meaningful progress to significantly reduce food loss and waste at scale will, of course, have to come from the national level, but just as importantly, also from subnational. And as such, these $300 million in shovel-ready investments that were outlined in the report come from primarily 6 countries where work is already underway, those being South Africa, Kenya, Indonesia, the United States, China, and Mexico, and one being Brazil, where early efforts demonstrate an opportunity worth highlighting and role modeling. So of course, as the world's population grows from $8 to $10 billion by 2050, it's really imperative that efforts to accelerate this top solution to climate change, as we heard Project Drawdown mention, not only take into consideration these cultural and regional nuances, but also coordinate efforts in the areas of greatest need and potential, which is why the report really calls out these 5 cross-border action areas for investment that any investor can support to realize a myriad of co-benefits beyond just waste diversion, whether that be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, saving consumers money and increasing farmer and business profits, restoring ecosystems and biodiversity, or ensuring that those that are experiencing hunger and food insecurity in our communities are really having access to healthy and nutritious food.